Good afternoon, everyone, and a very happy Thursday afternoon to everyone joining us for another Thursday lunchtime lecture from us here at the Church's Conservation Trust. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. If you're a new member joining us first time, do say hello. If you're a returning guest member of our lectures, please say hello and let us know where you're watching from. As is the custom with these lectures, the first 10 minutes is dedicated to what we call Church of the Week, where we try to find a church which is in the collection of one of the 356 churches in our care, which in some way has a connection with the lecture today. So without any further delay, I'm going to pass you on to our Chief Executive, Peter Ayres, who's going to get underway with Church of the Week. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks, George. You caught me a bit on the hop today, as I was so busy talking to our lecturer today that I've failed to prepare as quickly as normal. So bear with me as I fumble around and try to share my screen for a couple of minutes. Hopefully I won't take too long to do that. But you never know, because every week I seem to manage to do this. Right, let's try and get that going. Can we see that? Okay, good. Okay, right. Well, first of all, as always, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Ecclesiastical Insurance for sponsoring Church of the Week and their general support of the lunchtime lectures. It is very much appreciated. Now, today's church is not only a historic church, but it is possibly one of the most important churches in the care of the CCT, and it is St Peter's Church, Edlington in South Yorkshire. And it's important to us because it is the very first church that was vested into the care of the Church's Conservation Trust. In 1962, this building was declared redundant when the parishes of Old Edlington and New Edlington were merged. Sadly, what followed were several years of vandalism and neglect whilst a decision was made about the church's future. The Church's Conservation Trust was originally established in 1969 as a redundant churches fund and remains a unique partnership between church and state. We came into being via the Church of England's pastoral measure of 1968 and was approved by Parliament, including by the Redundant Churches and Other Religious Buildings Acts in 1969. The measure has been revised several times, the latest version being 2011 as revised in 2018, and at the moment General Synod have submitted a green paper that they're consulting on about how this piece of legislation might evolve for the future as well. This building here came actually into our care in 1971, so it took some time between us being formed and taking our first church on. But by that time, the church had its roof and windows deliberately removed in an attempt to turn it into a ruin. There are several ideas in conservation that making buildings into ruins is perhaps a good way in the future. St Peter's is actually a phenomenal example of a Norman church, and it's packed full of interesting features to see, such as this 12th century chancel arch decorated with chevrons that you can see here. Everywhere you look in and around this church, you'll discover peculiar carvings of animals and fantastic beasts. A Norman corbel, which you can see here, runs right along the south wall with a variety of carved figures depicting grotesque beasts and human heads. However, head inside the church and in the north aisle, which was added later in the 12th century, after the 12th century nave, you can see another Norman corbel run, which clearly once part of an exterior facing wall. The amazing carvings don't stop here, however, and when you first enter the church, you'll be greeted by this splendid example of Norman beakheads in the doorway with chevrons as well. Above one of the monuments in the north aisle, you'll be able to stop a Norman corbel, be able to see a Norman corbel depicting an ox. It's worth taking your time to explore each corbel, as they're each individually handcrafted and they have their unique personalities, as you can see from this very clear picture. I wanted to bring you back to the Norman chancel arch and quickly show you the 12th century pillar capital that supports the arch, as it is again a beautifully handcrafted piece of work. Now, this picture here shows you how St Peter's looked when it came to the CCT, in quite a sorry state after the effort to turn it into a ruin. I hope you'll agree that it looks much better today with our care and intervention in saving it. Sadly, churches in England, when redundant, can still be demolished, and there are many churches across the land which don't have a bright future ahead of them once they're declared closed. This is why our work at CCT is perhaps more important than ever, because we live in a time when threats facing our historic churches are very significant. We can't save historic churches on our own, and that's why our strategy is all about how we can support and empower communities across the country to use and love these historic places of worship and to care for them. We're extremely grateful to the thousands of volunteers who help us in so many ways to care for these buildings. But you can help as well. You can go and visit one of our 356 churches, and we're going to be taking on more soon. You can volunteer with us in lots of different and exciting ways, but you can also help us and future generations by becoming a member or making a donation to help with the conservation that these buildings are looked after. And becoming a member is a real stay. We will stay in touch and let you know how we're getting on, what work's going on, and how you can support the work of the trust. And you can be part of this growing movement of people to save these fantastic buildings. Finally, I thought I'd finish with a very naughty image of one of the carvings on the tower here. So say hello to a Sean Nagig, the male equivalent of a Sheila Nagig. This naughty carving featured in last year's Naughty Things in Parish Churches with Emma Wells. And if you do visit this church, it's obviously a thing you've got to try and spot and ask your question of why is this thing on one of our churches? Thank you, George.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I think everyone watching will agree that this is a really spectacular church. And to see that transformation from it being in almost a ruinous state into a really well cared for heritage asset for the community to use and love today. So everyone, we've got a couple of minutes before we'll start this lecture. So again, a warm welcome to those of you joining us. So we're going to ask a couple of questions that have come in for Peter. So if you've got any questions, please do comment away. And now's your chance to ask our Chief Executive any questions you might have. So Peter, you talked about in Church of the Week there about the challenges facing churches today. How significant is that challenge? And is it a real problem? Should I say, is it a real threat that churches are facing across the country at the moment?
Well, it's hard to generalize because there are always good examples of how things are being well managed and looked after. But I think there's a genuine shift. The society is becoming quite more secularized in a way, and the buildings are under threat, particularly in the countryside. And given the extraordinary number of historic places of worship we have in this country, that is an issue, and how we look after them for the future. What's getting obvious is the people who go to church, the demographics seem to be fairly elderly, and also in the countryside there's less people and they're older, and people are struggling with the burden of being an officer to look after these particular buildings. And that's why I think we at the Church Conservation Trust are working out how best to provide an infrastructure of support to support communities in the widest possible sense, look after these buildings, because it's not just their religious use. These are buildings with a profound relationship to the place that they are. They tell a story of that place like nothing else, as you've heard me say many times before. And it's really important that everyone realizes that these buildings are there for them, regardless of what they believe, where they come from, and who they are. Gender, race, doesn't matter. These buildings are, I believe, genuinely there for you. And the biggest problem, I think, is that society finds them irrelevant into the future and then doesn't care for them, when actually they're one of the most phenomenal and the most democratic of cultural resources that we have spread right across the country.
Thanks, Peter. And we're coming up to 1 o'clock, so I'm going to stop Church Week there, everyone. But everyone, that was our Church Week, and that was St. Peter's in Old Edlington, which is one of the South Yorkshire churches. Now, I was fortunate enough to be there a couple of months ago doing some filming there, and it's part of what's called the South Yorkshire Hub, which is being developed by one of our local community officers. So if you do go and visit that church, there are some really fantastic other CCT churches nearby that I highly, highly recommend that you go and have a look at whilst you're visiting Edlington. Now, you can find details of those churches on our website. So our website is visitchurch.org.uk. There's a map view, but if you do go on to certainly Edlington's page on our website, you'll see there's a guide about our churches in Yorkshire, which has got a list of all the close ones. So do have a look at that. But everyone, hello, and welcome to today's lecture. If you're joining us for the first time, as I said, do let us know where you're watching from. But everyone, a warm welcome to you. I hope for those of you who are joining us from the United Kingdom, I hope you're enjoying this warm weather. I've managed to escape from London to do some filming this week, so I've been quite fortunate to come to Suffolk, and even yesterday I got to a CCT church at Chiltern. You can watch the live stream tour of that, which is on our Facebook wall. But everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Now, as Peter said, there's different ways that you can support us. These lectures are always free of charge, but we do ask that if you enjoy these, that you are able to, please do consider making a donation to support our important work in caring for 356. And as you heard from Peter, that number is going to be increasing shortly. Now, there are some ways that you can support us. Peter said you can become a volunteer, but you can become also a member with the trust. Now, becoming a member is a great way to support us. Not only do you get some fantastic benefits, so you get a members magazine a couple of times a year, you get invitation to exclusive events. We also now run an exclusive member lecture series. So on the second Monday of the month, we've got an exclusive lectures series of lectures available just to members. But also, if you join us by direct debit and use the offer code LECTURE, and that's the word lecture in capitals, you'll get a free copy of Dr. Richard Stemp's book, Decoding Churches and Cathedrals, the Secret Language of Christianity's Sacred Buildings. Now, I haven't got it with me today, but I can promise you it's a really fantastic book. But if you look at our previous lectures, I've done some held it up, and I've shown some of the pages, but do consider becoming a member with us. Also, we've been selling books, and I'm really delighted, and thank you so much to everyone who's been buying copies with us, because again, all the proceeds from selling books through our website goes directly into helping us to care for and support historic churches. So if you'd like to go and have a look at, we've got some really great titles on our book on our shop at the moment, and there's some really great offers and deals available. So do have a look on our shop for offers there. Now, if you've got any questions, do let me know, comment away if there's any technical problems. But for those of you who are joining us for the first time, and one of the best things about these lectures, at the end of our guest lecture, there's going to be time for you to ask our lecturer questions. So please do use that comment box on Facebook. If you're catching up on YouTube, please do put your questions in, because we do try and respond to them. But let us know if you have any questions, and we'll do our best to put them to our lecturer at the end of the talk. Now, that's enough from me this morning, or afternoon, sorry. So I'm going to pass you back to our Chief Executive, who's going to introduce today's lecture.
Thank you, George. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Andrew Chandler to be with us today, especially as I do have his book on the Church of England in the 20th century, which has been very useful in some work we've been doing looking at the legislation regarding how churches close. So I'd like to say a personal thank you to him, first of all, for that piece of research and the book, because it's been very helpful. Now, Andrew is a professor of modern history at the University of Chichester, and he was for some years the director of the George Bell Institute, first at the Queen's Foundation for Ecumenical Education in Birmingham, and then at the University of Chichester. He's published widely in the field of 20th century religious heritage, often focusing on British churches and their experience of international politics. His substantial study, the book that I just referenced, The Church of England in the 20th Century, The Church Commissioners and the Politics of Reform, 1948 to 1998, was first published in 2006. And Andrew is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. I nearly made the lecture a bit late today because I was really enjoying talking to Andrew, and I hope we can catch up at some point after the lecture, Andrew, because it would be a great pleasure to spend some more time with you. I'm very grateful to you for giving your time free to the CCT to enable this lecture series to take place. So without further ado, here's Andrew Chandler.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that very gracious introduction. And I'd also like to thank George very much for the help that he's given in all the technological arts, not all of which are entirely obvious to me. Those of you who labour your way through introductions and prefaces and acknowledgements in books will often find that there's a usual convention that you thank as many people as you should thank, but you also make quite sure that you won't implicate any of them in your own mistakes. And therefore, if any mistakes do occur over the next 45 minutes, I should wish to make sure that my responsibility for them is entire. Now, I've been very kindly invited to talk about the Church Commissioners. And the Church Commissioners are, in a sense, a curious entity because in the life of the Church of England, they represent, for much of the last 100 years, a sort of monumental, impressive obscurity. They're active behind the scenes in so many different ways. Their fingers are in so many different pies. One would expect them to be more obvious to the church imagination than they might perhaps have become. Now, this is very largely an organization concerned with buildings. I thought it would be useful to start with some buildings on this particular note. Now, this is not, of course, an ecclesiastical building. This is actually something rather civic, even rather municipal. And some of you may recognize it. It's planted very firmly and purposefully in the middle of Westminster. It's a design of the late 19th century by a much admired architectural company overseen by W.D. Carrow. And what we have here is a bastion of ecclesiastical authority, looking virtually into the windows of Parliament itself and just around the corner from Westminster Abbey. Now, of course, architecture declares an argument as well as a purpose. And what we really see in this particular building is an avowal of purpose. This is an institution which is here to oversee the affairs of a great church in all their intricacy and all their long-term perspectives. It wasn't, of course, first the building of the church commissioners, because it was built for the ecclesiastical commissioners. And it's important to acknowledge that the organization that we call the church commissioners was the achievement of a union between a much older body, the Queen Anne Bounty, which was established under Queen Anne to support often impecunious clergy, and the ecclesiastical commissioners, a great work of the 19th century, full of the zeal really to reform the church, to organize its affairs, and to make it truly and effectively modern. And in that union, I think one can see a great deal of the character of the life and work that went on within this building. Now, I spend a lot of my time, of course, writing and thinking about history, and I tend to think not of buildings, but of personalities. When I was first invited to look at the history of the church commissioners and to write their story from 1948 to 1998, a date in which their affairs were thoroughly reconfigured, I wasn't quite sure of how I would approach it, and you might well feel in the same condition now. This building might not inspire you to pick up an article or a book on the subject itself. Are we necessarily very much attracted by the lives of institutions? Are we necessarily very interested in the people we might find at work there? Particularly, we might work in such things ourselves. We might rather like a rest from them, perhaps. Often, I think it's the case that people work in institutions they barely understand. Well, I think I was rather like that when I first looked at this enterprise. And the way that I found my approach may seem rather surprising to you. In fact, I'm a little anxious. It might seem rather pretentious. This is a painting by Rembrandt, which many of you will, I think, know. The Syndics of the Drapers Guild, 1662. And what is interesting to me about this is that actually what he's really looking at is a company, an organization, an institution which has a very practical purpose. And the achievement of the painting, of course, is not simply one of balancing a composition or achieving a particular flow of colors. It is that he's humanized the institution. He's acknowledged that these people are individuals. They have faces, they're interacting, they have something in front of them. And yes, they're engaging with the artist, but they're also busy people and they have practical objects before them. And I thought, well, actually, this is interesting because although I'm certainly no Rembrandt and certainly no painter of pictures, alas, what I have to do is somehow achieve a humanizing of the institution, a detachment of it from its architecture, from its practical purposes, and in a sense to show that it's part of human history and something that we might recognize and begin to interpret. So what kind of figures do we find in the Church Commission as an organization which was achieved through a union in two parts in 1948, a significant date to which I will refer? Well, here's one of our syndics. This is Malcolm Trustram Eve, who became in 1963, I think, Lord Silsoe. And that suggests a very impressive public career. And certainly Malcolm Trustram Eve was a very impressive figure altogether. He had a strong and successful background in business, in the world of concrete, to be precise, and he regarded himself as a figure of the secular world, as much, if not more, than a figure of an ecclesiastical one. Now, what Malcolm Trustram Eve wanted to do was to achieve a new meeting place between the patterns and the rhythms and the ambitions of contemporary society and the institution of an ancient church as it tried to blend with its new landscapes. Well, he looks rather hawkish there. He would certainly look even more so when he was older, when he became Lord Silsoe, the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time. Michael Ramsey named his cat after him. And there was a sense that Lord Silsoe was very much a man in power, man in authority, somebody who knew how to stand up to, well, just about anybody, and certainly an Archbishop of Canterbury. There is therefore a sense that Malcolm Trustram Eve represented an institutional personality of a particular kind, somebody who had immense confidence in the institution, which in a sense lay within his hands, and great interest and commitment in the purposes to which that institution, as a practical, administrative, and reforming body, could be put. But what happens, I wonder, when you put Malcolm Trustram Eve into the same room as this figure, Archbishop Geoffrey Fisher? Now, many of you will perhaps recognize Fisher, and I've chosen this photograph partly because it represents a very recognizable Fisher indeed. Here he is, looking as though he's just pointing out somebody in the classroom or an assembly who is going to ask him a particular question which he knows he can answer. What kind of a figure was Fisher? Well, Fisher has not attracted an enormous amount of attention subsequently, and that's really the pity, because Fisher was someone who became Archbishop of Canterbury on the death of William Temple in 1944, largely because he was seen as a figure who could oversee the reform of the church, the attachment of an ancient body, movement, organization, all of those things, to a society that was now witnessing the prospect of immense change. So he may not look very exciting, and he wasn't a very exciting public speaker, and not a figure we've very often found in the context of great campaigns. But Fisher actually was someone who could connect with Malcolm Trustram Eve. They could sit in a room together and share their understandings of what the Church of England was, nationally, locally, in all its dimensions, and come to a mind. And that meant that while Geoffrey Fisher and Malcolm Trustram Eve were working together, you could certainly expect things to happen. Between 1948 and 1961, when Fisher ceased to be Archbishop of Canterbury, a good deal did. But Fisher was a particular model of an Archbishop of Canterbury, and Michael Ramsey was perhaps a very different model. This photograph captures him looking benign, slightly mystic perhaps, even rather quizzical, possibly not quite hearing the question that's been raised. What did Ramsey and Lord Silsoe, as he became, make of each other? Well, I think to some extent they found themselves in a relationship of mutual incomprehension, but they had to work with each other. And that is an interesting illustration of what made the Church Commissioners distinctive. They had to achieve some kind of rapport between the world of the clergy and the world of a church that was structured in its archbishops, its bishops, its dioceses, its parishes and its parochial clergy, and the new mandates of post-war society, which would be thoroughly recognizable to the people of any corporation in the secular order at large. Now, I've mentioned the importance of 1948. 1948 matters because the creation of the new church commissioners occurred within a historical context which is very recognizable to us indeed. And that is the achievement of the new Labour government elected 3 years before, and at that very time pursuing a path of domestic reform through the methods of centralization, rationalization, and redistribution. And these arts of the later 1940s became, in a sense, the essential methods of a new age of consensus within British society at large. And society, represented by its religious movements and currents and loyalties, could feel them as sharply and as creatively as anybody else. Therefore, far from being a rather dull, rather dour church administration, given the task of some fairly unexciting odds and ends, we're actually looking at a meeting place between the church and contemporary society within a particular political moment, within a particular political ambition. And what was therefore before all of these people was the prospect of change, overseeing change, achieving it through reform, through empirical, rational adjustment and oversight. There was no great ideology at work here, but there were certainly clear and fertile principles. The church commissioners therefore represented a meeting place of all kinds of interesting possibilities and all kinds of people who might otherwise never have encountered each other. And all of them did so within the context of a new church within a new society. Now, all of that may seem very remote to you, remote from perhaps the present that is known to us, or perhaps from the idea of churches and their redundancy. But it's important to recognize at the very beginning that this new post-war world, which is represented perhaps, to my mind, starkly by this photograph of St. Mary le Port in Bristol, this new world was having to grapple with the question of how do you actually live in the present, given that you are surrounded by the debris of the past. What are you now to rebuild, to salvage, to conserve? What are you to build again? Where is the meeting place between the turbulence of the past and the new ambition to look forward to a peaceful future? The point, therefore, is that what happened to churches, whether they were continuing as they had before, or whether they were looking rather like St. Mary le Port, or whether they were actually turning up in the new landscapes of post-war Britain, all of these things actually were interrelating. Therefore, there is an intense dialogue between what is new and looking forward and what is old and is actually representative of an eloquent past. Well, here's the present and here's the way the future was looking. This is an estate in Coventry in the late 1950s, and it's always, I think, important to recognize that the new landscapes that were achieved by the New Towns Act, for example, of 1946, or the Town Development Act of 1952, were not simply new estates, they were new civilizations, if you will. This certainly looks like a new civilization. It's a set of houses, very carefully designed, conceived, built, and also a sense of being a community. And this is something that needs to be borne in mind. 2 million people were effectively displaced by the experience of the Second World War in this country. And massive internal migration was the order of the day. the population was actually doing two things that required fundamental reconsideration from every responsible authority. One is that it was moving, and the second is that it was growing, and growing in ways that the people had hardly predicted before the early 1950s. This is what the future looked like. What about the churches? Were the churches to be present in this new civilization, or were they actually to be left in the background? Well, here's an example of a new church very much from that period. This is the Church of the Ascension in Crown Hill, Plymouth. I've chosen this for a number of reasons, some of which are dubiously personal. But the important thing to recognize is that this was a new church in what the Anglicans at this time called a new housing area. And what it represents aesthetically, artistically, culturally is very distinctive. You might ask yourselves the question, would you conserve this building if it became redundant? Well, Eric Turnbull, who was its galvanizing first priest, was a man of some real vision as well as experience. And he was very clear that new churches shouldn't just be functional, practical, they should appeal to an idea of beauty and place that ideal within the new communities of the post-war world. The opportunity, in a sense, to break free from the architectural confinements of a medieval structure or a Victorian edifice of any kind, and rethink the whole idea of how a priest meets a community in worship is here represented with some boldness and, in my mind, some eloquence. This church is still with us today, but Crown Hill, a new estate all around it, has had a very different history in many ways. The reason I must confess that I've chosen this is that my father was a Baptist minister on the Crown Hill estate at about the time when the Church of the Ascension was very much a new building. And the different fortunes of the two buildings is, in its sense, a commentary on the post-war new society and what really became of it. Now, what I've suggested so far is that far from being a narrative of decline, redundancy, and then the great question mark of what do you do with these vacated spaces, the fate of England's historic churches was caught up in something that was immensely complicated. Modernity could produce all kinds of embarrassments, often embarrassments that would never have occurred to those who created the churches themselves in the first place. I think, for example, of the Church of St. Matthew in Leicester, which was built in 1823 and had seating for 800 people. By the 1950s, the area had changed so completely that there were less than 25 people living there as residents. And the church found itself stranded as a little ecclesiastical island in a great landscape of industrial estates. Change is very rarely ordered. How you manage change, therefore, is a very interesting question. And it was a question that concerned the church commissioners. I've referred to the 1946 Act and the 1952 Town Development Act, acts which in many ways created this new sense of a social order. It's important to recognize that the Church of England, and I shall be talking about the Church of England specifically today, was producing a parallel narrative of acts of legislation. Now, there had been a Union of Benefices Act since 1923, but in 1951-2, a new Union of Benefices Act came through, which for the first time appropriated, in brackets, the term disused churches. And this showed that the connection between remodeling the parochial order and closing down churches was a very intimate one indeed. What happens when you unite a benefice? Recognized that a parish must be served by a priest. But if priests are fewer and further between, then the parish changes. And this is an important rule because it meant that actually if you unite benefices, then a number of previously quite different parishes with churches of quite different characters have to find a new model and often have to identify one building as one building that will remain in use, creating redundancy elsewhere. Now, this began to produce all kinds of new interrelationships, very densely woven. In 1952, church and state began to consider together the future of historic redundant churches, and the Historic Churches Preservation Trust came into existence. And what was important about that was that it showed that the churches weren't simply thinking of themselves and looking to their own. There was a relationship with the state. That was important to explore. It was important to explore because churches were seen as parts of society, and society was what an even larger state was supposed to care about. But there were also financial realities here. And the Historic Churches Preservation Trust announced a connection in financial terms over the question of the preservation of these buildings. In 1960, the Bridges Commission began to explore again the question of how one actually deals with redundancy, how one pays for it, how one maintains churches that have fallen out of use. And this was drawn together in a colossal bit of Anglican legislation, the 1968 pastoral measure, an immense leviathan of church legislation, which would daunt even the most enthusiastic church politician. What happened in 1968 within all of this pastoral reorganization was the creation of the Redundant Churches Committee and the Redundant Churches Fund. And therefore one can begin to see in the 1950s and 1960s that the institutional arrangements are altering. We can see that through the legislation passed by the Church Assembly and later on by General Synod. We can see that in a readjustment of the relationship between church and state. In short, the furniture of these questions is altering, is being moved around and is being revised. It may not look like a very glamorous campaign for reform, but that is still essentially what it amounts to. And the question that underlies it is, how does the church actually live in its past and also acknowledge the reality of the present and look in some responsible way to the possibilities of the future? I want to emphasize the complexity of this. There is no single narrative that attaches itself to the question of church redundancy. What we really find is that life in the English parish showed the complexities of life at large. The union of benefices involved local loyalties, sometimes ecclesiastical loyalties, or appeals to party. What, for example, would happen if you wanted to unite parishes where one parish had had an Anglo-Catholic church and the other had had an evangelical church? Well, you don't need me to tell you that, of course, controversy and provocation and unhappiness were simply waiting to break the surface, and often they did. This is therefore a meeting place between local opinion and individual experience, the reality of communities, then the structure of the church, the way the parish encounters the designs of the diocese, and then the church commissioners. Well, how did they find themselves caught up in all of this? The church commissioners effectively had to oversee all these many complex interactions. It was their power effectively to adjudicate, and it was not a power to be lightly worn. If, for example, the redundancy of a church came up and a member of the board of the church commissioners came from the diocese in question, he or she would have to absent themselves from the deliberations of the board. And therefore, I want to emphasize that there was an attempt, therefore, to see that local experience and vision wasn't enough. It could be very emotionally charged. It could be lopsided, emotional, all of those things. The church commissioners therefore sought to appeal to the idea that the detached, more nearly objective mind meeting in a building in central London could actually answer a question where the partial narratives and interests and loyalties of local opinion might fail. But it was, of course, a dangerous strategy, because many of those who felt deeply about the closure of churches in a particular place might feel that the gentlemen in London, to use a phrase that I remember in one very condemnatory letter from the 1950s, were too remote really to understand what was going on, and could therefore hardly be qualified to adjudicate. Added to the question of structure within the church, locally and nationally, one also had to recognize that what happened to church buildings was becoming more and more an interest to various organizations. The Friends of Friendless Churches, for example, the Ancient Monument Society. In time, there will be more societies. Victorian Society, 20th Century Society, to whom we owe the image of the Church of the Ascension in Crown Hill. The cluster of interest added layer upon layer upon layer of difficulty to the question of church closure. And sometimes, because the church commissioners had to deal under their own requirements with every objection that was made, sometimes the objections could be remarkably eccentric. A stonemason called B.J. Lloyd wrote a succession of letters of protest and objection to the church commissioners through the 1950s and into the 1960s. And his argument was essentially this: society was not divided into classes or communities or anything else for that matter. It was really divided between the scribes and the masons. It was the masons who created the reality of a religious society. It was the scribes who were always basically pulling the thing down. Where religion was expressive, creative, lively, it was because the Masons were really in charge. And where religion declined and fell apart and lost the interest of the public imagination, it was because the scribes had taken over. As far as Lloyd was concerned, redundancy was an issue to be seen exactly in these terms. His answer to the decline of churches and the redundancy of church buildings was, in fact, to commission more church ornaments than ever before, because only in such a way could the minds of the English people be engaged by the great vision of religion. I can remember another objection, which was written, I think, a good deal later than B.J. Lloyd, suggesting that the church surely shouldn't shut down this nice Victorian urban church that was almost derelict. Why, after all, couldn't they shut down what you call the ugly Baptist church that was just around the corner? Wouldn't that be far more sensible after all? Now, the point that I want to make is therefore that the redundancy of church buildings is something that becomes immensely complicated in itself because it occurs within this lively context where so many people have different views. And one of the problems really with this is that actually all of them are right in their way. Somehow the church commissioners had, on a case-by-case basis, to work out what became of a church that was becoming redundant. Could a church building that had been so-called consecrated be simply removed from worship? Should it be deconsecrated? Did the whole thing, after all, have any legal meaning whatsoever? should a church building be appropriated by another body which could make use of it? Should it be sold? If so, to whom? Should there be any restrictive clauses? Should it be demolished altogether? And you can tell that these questions in themselves engage different sensibilities. So the question of demolition, for example. Could you demolish an ancient building? No, of course there would be a preservation order, but the churches that were in the 1950s and 60s most vulnerable were, of course, Victorian urban churches, which lacked a constituency of interest at that particular time, and which were becoming redundant at a very considerable speed indeed. I think that it's important to recognize that what happened to these redundant churches, in a sense, expresses the history of British society every bit as much as all the rest of it. It's not just simply a question of religion, it's not simply a question of secularization and decline, nor is it, for that matter, the question of how to create a new society with a migrating population and a growing population too. No, it's something that actually involves layers of intricacy at every point. And the hope of the church commissioners was that they had the capacity, the experience, the knowledge, the insight, the understanding to deal with it. The question, therefore, for them was, how do you actually control this narrative in a way that is responsible? If those who feared for the fabric of ancient or beautiful buildings were to be heard, how were their claims to be weighed against those of a diocese, which may no longer see a reason for a church to exist and therefore to be a cost altogether? Now, the best way, I suspect, of looking at this is to recognize that the stories that we find are invariably local stories. Redundancy was therefore something that involved local experience more than anything else. One of the first churches that I came across when I was doing the work for the Church Commissioner's book was the Church of All Hallows on the Wall in Exeter. And here you have it on your screen now. I wonder what you think of it. Would you conserve that church, or would you knock it down, or would you turn it into something else? What would you turn it into? Well, by 1945, this church had been redundant for quite a long time, and it had found all kinds of new and often enterprising uses. I think for a period of time, parachutes were made in All Hallows Church on the Wall, and then it became a repository for blind basket makers, who were there for much of the war. And the church in the Exeter diocese didn't really know what to do about it. Part of the problem was that the churchyard was actually owned by the city corporation. And therefore, it was a question of not straightforward ownership either. Many of you will recognize all too quickly that the ownership of land is often very complicated indeed. Well, in many ways, what happened inside All Hallows Church hardly seemed to notice, let alone bother local ecclesiastical authorities, until in 1945, the Archdeacon observed that it had been turned into a corset-making factory. And this actually was something that seemed to push the principle a little bit too far. In 1949, the corset-making factory disappeared after sustained protestations from the church, and in time, the story of All Hallows Church on the Wall receded from view altogether. Rather gently, its decline and disappearance does not turn up, for example, as an item in the papers of the Church Commissioners. Now, if that looks fairly quiet, this church was anything but quiet. This is St. Michael's Church in Derby. This was a central Derby church, only 120 yards from the cathedral, a home of Anglo-Catholicism within the city itself. And in the 1950s, when the battles were fought over St. Michael's Church, there were at least 140 people on the electoral roll, and they were maintaining their diocesan share, as we now call it, perfectly ruggedly. Why, therefore, should this church be closed? In fact, when the bishop moved to declare its redundancy, a very active parochial church council simply declared that it wasn't redundant, whatever might be said by the authorities in charge. The public campaign was extremely voluble. In 1956, the Soviet Union invaded Hungary, and comparisons were made in Derby between the onslaught against Hungary by the Soviet Union and the onslaught against the congregation of St. Michael's in Derby as well. There was even at least one claim of a miracle from a woman who was cured, apparently after the repeated intercessions of the congregation there. Dictatorship correspondence warned in the local press and in the national press too could not just be found in the Soviet Union. The war against religion seemed to be conducted even in a place like Derby itself. Now, closure, in a sense, produced the argument of what to do next. The idea of the diocese was that St. Michael's could be made available for the worship of the Serbian Orthodox Church. There were 300 Serbians living in the city at that time, and another 300 in Stoke-on-Trent, not too far away. And this shows that the history of redundancy was beginning to lean heavily into the question, not just of what you do with these places, but how do you actually connect with the realities of this new multicultural society and all the various and diverse religious expressions which occur in that context. Most anguished was the case of St. Mary's in Saviltown in Dewsbury. Now, this photograph here, the definition is not ideal, I'm afraid, but I hope the overall effect is clear to you. This church was a new construction. It was only 70 years old in about 1970. And you can see that it's Chapel of Ease, actually. And here it is being opened within a community which has gathered around it. The reality is that that community was going to change. In the 1960s, growing percentage of the local population of Dewsbury was recently an immigrant and was largely Muslim. There was a sense, therefore, what you do with a redundant church, and St. Mary's had been redundant for some time, when you have an application for possession and use as a mosque. Now, the battle that went on in Saviltown went on actually for many years. It involved the Bishop, Eric Treacy, it involved local residents, it involved all kinds of deputations, consultations, discussions, and most of them actually went absolutely nowhere. Treacy himself felt that the church commissioners should recognise the bishop was the crucial part of the equation of consultation and do pretty much as he decided. But Betty Ridley, the third Church Estates Commissioner, was not quite so convinced that this was so. The difficulty faced by the board of the church commissioners, therefore, was not simply a little local one, to use Harold Macmillan's famous phrase. It was one that actually drew upon ramifications for international mission, multiculturalism, and all kinds of other things. And all of this was being played out while the Church of St. Mary's was falling to pieces and while vandals knocked even bigger bits off it week by week. What eventually happened in Saviltown was demolition and the giving of the site to the Muslims of Dewsbury to build upon. But it was a painful business. And I think it's important to recognize the reality of that anxiety, that frustration, and that angst altogether felt up and down the church as well as within the place itself. Now, I'll give you just one more example. This is St. Luke's Church in Southampton, and you can see from its architecture that, again, it's a church of the 19th century. Now, the central churches in Southampton had a fundamental rethink, one might say, in the 1970s and 1980s. Bishop John Taylor, Bishop of Winchester at this time, was very clear that St. Luke's Church had finished its life as a centre of Christian worship. Very few people disagreed with that. But what he really argued was that the Sikhs of Southampton could find in St. Luke's a new place of worship. Now, the church commissioners twitched because their fingers had been burnt in Dewsbury. And what was interesting about the story of St. Luke's Church in Southampton was it showed that even where the bishop was entirely clear about what was happening, and even where local Christian opinion, and this is significantly later incidentally, and I should mention this as the story really of the early 1980s, where local Christian opinion firmly favoured the Sikhs of Southampton, the church commissioners wanted to be sure. And so they looked back to General Synod. They acknowledged that while they had a certain amount of latitude in the way they looked at these questions of redundancy, they also might get into a great deal of trouble. Well, turning to General Synod produced absolutely nothing. And the story of St. Luke's of Southampton eventually resolved itself fairly cleanly on a local basis. And the church commissioners, well, they had to go along with it. Now, by October 1995, of 1,400 churches examined by the church commissioners in their various committees and forums since 1968, 800 were converted to new uses, and 300 were vested in the Redundant Churches Fund, which became the Church's Conservation Trust of today, and 300 were demolished altogether. And I think it's important, therefore, to recognise that the problem, if we are to regard it as a problem, was a growing one. But it was not simply a question of the decline of Christianity. It was a question of how British society was living and working, breathing and moving in the new contexts of a very distinct age indeed. Patterns of growth were to be found not simply parallel to patterns of decline, but actually working with them. And what by the end of the 20th century one really sees is a sense of new complexity with many vested interests, many stakeholders, as people now say, many different points of view, often held by enthusiasts of various kinds, administrators, bureaucrats, and all the rest. But the history of the church commissioners show that this is not simply a story of provincial life. This was something that over 50 years began to draw upon the major themes by which historians now come to understand the landscapes of modern British experience altogether. And in all of these respects, therefore, the redundancy of church buildings and what became of them continues to teach us a great deal about the world we inhabit today.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that lecture. That's really been quite profound, and there's been some really interesting topics that you've teased out there. So thank you so much. Everyone, we're now going to go into question time, and I'm really delighted that we've already had some questions come in. So if you've anyone watching, if you've got any questions for Andrew, please do comment away, and I'll do my best to put them to Andrew now. But for those of you watching, if you'd like to support us in return for these free lectures, you can do so in a couple of ways. You can text CCT to 70331 to give us a gift of £3. You can donate completely securely any amount you wish on our website, which is visitchurches.org.uk. You can also look at some of our lecture books on our website. Or, as we said at the start of this lecture, there is a special membership offer running at the moment. So if you join us as a member from just £3.50 a month and use the offer code LECTURE, and that's lecture in capitals at the checkout, you'll be sent a free copy of Decoding the Sacred Symbolism of Christianity's Holiest Buildings, so churches and cathedrals, and that's written by Dr. Richard Stemp. And I've literally, during that lecture, just had a phone call from the customs, and the books have arrived, and I've just taken just organised delivery for them, so they'll be coming into the office next week, so we'll be posting them out all next week for everyone. So I'm going to dive straight into questions. There's been some really good ones. I'm really everyone, well done on some of these questions. I think they're fantastic, some of these coming in today. Andrew, can you explain or give your thoughts on any reasonings behind why do you think there are, in the landscape, there are some historic churches which, you talked about the post-war and the construction era and sort of new estates being built, but one of the other things that was obviously being built were new motorways, new roads right across the English countryside, and this new kind of national infrastructure. How do you think it came to be that lots of churches, and particularly historic ones, became very isolated from the historic landscape, were cut off from villages by new roads? Do you think the church didn't have any influence on town planning at that time?
Oh, I think it's such a good question, and it's a theme that I have thought about a good deal in reflecting on this lecture, and I'm not really drawn perhaps into the picture as I should have done. Road widening schemes. You think about any British town or city post the 1960s, and you realise that the amount that has changed is simply colossal, but it's actually fundamental as well. It has changed the logic of British cities in all kinds of ways. And I don't think there is an English town or city that doesn't actually declare those effects. Road widening, the advent of the motor car, was one of the principal reasons for change of this kind. And of course, it could dislocate communities from buildings that were once regarded primarily as communal buildings. There's no question about that at all. Could the church have done anything more? I doubt it. I think that in a sense, it comes back to who owns the land and what use is made of it. Was it even absolutely clear that a road widening scheme would threaten the cause of English public religion? Well, not entirely, because many of those who were in charge of the church at various levels didn't necessarily think that that was definitively represented by an individual building here or there. They tended to think much more in terms of communities. Where are the communities to be found? Are there places of worship to be found there too? And if they have been dislocated or detached, then of course the nature of the interest suggested a different point of view. But I think that this is extremely important area, and I think all of you who are watching will recognise that you only have to think of your local towns or the cities nearby to recognise just what an immense impact road widening actually had, not simply on the layout of post-war British towns and cities, but the communal life, the social interactions, and the religion too that could be discerned within them.
Thanks, Andrew. And the experience of the last 18 months, so the COVID-19 pandemic, seems to have speeded up the decline in church attendance. This particular person said, "I fear it will lead to more churches closing. What will the church need to do to manage the churches that may soon be abandoned, do you think?"
Well, I think that the impact of the pandemic is becoming very clear in terms of the use of church buildings, and in fact in the history of British Christianity altogether. So I think the first thing I would say is to emphasize, I think, the justice of that comment. What about the churches and what should they do about it? I think that in a sort of way, well, it runs into the content, insofar as I'm imagining it at the moment, of my second lecture. I mean, one of the great difficulties, of course, in trying to manage the present is that nobody really understands it, and nobody really quite knows where they're going. So everybody is clutching at straws. I think that in many ways, the churches themselves are changing. The relationship the Church of England has with its own space, with its own sense of what it now calls mission or missional strategy, I believe, is also something that is changing. And I think that it's hard to know where all of that is actually going to go. So I think my basic answer comes down to this. Nobody's in charge. The people who are in charge are thinking in all sorts of different ways about what they really want. And I think that what will come out of this inevitably will be some renegotiation of the relationship between church, state, and community, particularly between church and state in the care of buildings that now become redundant, and that will become a meeting place between conservation and preservation societies of various kind, local communities who may be looked to devise alternative uses, and the brutal question of finance. You know, sometimes dioceses have had a vested interest in closing down churches because they don't believe they're paying the way, and this doesn't necessarily accord with local opinion. In the 1940s and 1950s, it was sometimes murmured that if you closed a church, you diverted the income, which is actually right. So who was the beneficiary of the income? I think in all my work, the reality of the diocese as an organization has become very, very firmly planted in my mind. And therefore, it is the diocese that will actually have to manage a great deal of what happens. But financially, they won't provide the answer because the dioceses are not exactly robust financial powers either, and they're looking to invest their money in quite different things at the moment. It is, I think, unavoidable, whether it is right or wrong, unavoidable that the state will have to be drawn into negotiations which represent the different interests which are concerned for the future of these buildings, because that is where the money lies. And the only reason, in many ways, the church commissioners were active participants in this discussion from 1948 onwards was, again, because they had the power to finance solutions.
Thank you for that answer, Andrew. And another question here is, how did the church commissioners view campaigners such as John Betjeman and Lady Harrod?
Oh, I think very benignly. I don't think it would be right to characterize the church commissioners as a discrete organization as having a particular view. The church commissioners represented all kinds of different views. The board, for example, made up all kinds of different interests: clerical, lay, regional, all the rest of it. It's one of those things that make it very difficult, reasons why it's very difficult to define the church commissioners. And I think, therefore, the ideas promoted by figures like Betjeman, most famously perhaps, would have been entirely amenable and not at all threatening, because they were being led by all kinds of things, and Mr. Betjeman was undoubtedly one of them. Betjeman, in many ways, provoked all kinds of allies, friends, sympathizers, and supporters, all kinds of adversaries and supporters, adversaries and foes, not least in the churches themselves. He was very clear, for example, that Anglo-Catholic churches should be conserved in their interiors at a time when many Anglo-Catholic congregations were doing what in his eyes amounted to nothing less than vandalism inside their own church buildings. So it's not a very simple one, but I think one again has to look at a case-by-case story. But it's a very, very good question. Thank you.
So there's been a couple of comments I've seen talking about comparing how we responded in post-war Britain to how other continental countries responded with rebuilding. So someone said here, they've never been to Germany, but they understand that in West Germany, at least, there were sensitive attempts to rebuild historic city centres as they had been before the war. In historic British cities, for example, Canterbury, buildings that sustained even small bomb damage were flattened and replaced by brutalist horrors. Is this wholly accurate of what actually happened?
Well, I think I would want to say two things. Firstly, that the comparative perspective, which our friend introduces, is absolutely right. It's not just international; it's interdenominational. One of the things that affected, for example, the public debate over St Mary's and Saviltown in Dewsbury was the fact that those of other faiths were to be found in redundant Methodist churches in the area, for example, and no such controversy had occurred in those terms. And when you look abroad, of course, what happened in Germany is very, very significant indeed. I think chronology also defines a great deal. Having accepted the terms of the question, I think I would want to complicate them, because things do change a great deal between the 1960s and 70s and 80s. They're continuing to change now. And I think that it would be wrong to say that churches in this country in the post-war period were simply flattened to make way for new things, whether they were horrors or not. The pattern is more complex. Where the churches were ancient, they were conserved if it was possible, or exposed to what in the 1980s were called controlled ruination, which was an interesting idea. But there were rules through preservation. As I've suggested, it is the 19th century churches that are vulnerable, whether one thinks there were things of beauty or monstrosities, and whether one thinks that what came afterwards was beautiful or monstrous is always a difficult matter. But I think that I would suggest, although it's always irritating when a lecturer does this, that the answer does lie in complexities rather than generalizations, and it would be worth looking closely at Canterbury and to see what actually did happen to these buildings individually in the new context of the post-war settlement.
Thank you, Andrew. And everyone, thank you for your questions today. That kind of brings us to the end of our allotted time for today's lunchtime lecture. Again, Andrew, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us. And everyone, thank you for watching. Now, next week, we are going back to looking out in a more focused and more detailed view at the Oxford movement and Anglo-Catholicism in England. This will bring to a conclusion a month-long series, effectively, looking at the Oxford movement in England. So we're really excited to be joined by a former employee of the Church's Conservation Trust, Roy Tricker, who is a lay reader and very active in the Diocese of St Edmundsbury in Ipswich, and he is a fantastic local historian. And Roy's going to be talking to us about bells, smells and persecution, glimpses into the Anglo-Catholic revival, particularly in Suffolk, and also crossing the border into Norfolk as well. So do join us at the same time, so from 12:50 p.m. next Thursday for that lecture. Now, as I said, everyone, if you've got any questions, please keep them coming in. We will do our best to get answers to you, but also what we might do is try and expand some of your questions, because some of those questions you've asked today, I think would make fantastic in-depth blog articles. So please keep your questions coming and we'll do our best to get answers to you. But as always, let us know if you've got any ideas for future topics you'd like us to do, or any potential speakers you'd like us to try and arrange for you to enjoy listening to. But everyone, have a fantastic week, and we look forward to seeing you next week.